My wife refused to help my mom. I pulled the plug on her grandma's $4,800 per month. I used to believe that marriage was a sanctuary where the concept of family expanded, where the burdens of one became the shared responsibility of both. I learned the hard way that for my wife, family was an exclusive, gated community, and my own mother simply didn't meet the financial requirements for entry. I didn't shout when my wife told me that my mother's broken body wasn't our problem. I didn't throw my coffee cup against the kitchen wall or draft divorce papers in a fit of blind rage. I just looked down at the $4,800 electronic receipt on my phone for her grandmother's luxury-assisted living suite, and I realized that the bank of my blind loyalty was officially closed. My name is Arthur. I am 38 years old, and until a freezing Tuesday in November, I honestly thought I was building a life with a partner. My wife, Evelyn, comes from a family that specializes in appearances. They possess the kind of generational pride that insists on presenting a wealthy facade, even when the actual foundation is crumbling. 3 years ago, Evelyn's grandmother, Beatrice, suffered a mild stroke and could no longer live independently. The state-funded Medicaid facilities were, according to Evelyn and her mother, depressing and entirely unacceptable for a woman of Beatrice's stature. They insisted on Oak Grove Manor, a premium, resort-style continuing care community. It had a hydrotherapy pool, a private chef, and manicured gardens. It also had a price tag that Beatrice's Social Security and meager pension couldn't even begin to cover. There was a monthly shortfall of roughly $4,800. Evelyn's parents claimed they were tied up in bad investments. Evelyn herself, who worked part-time as an interior design consultant, certainly couldn't cover it. So I did. I am a senior structural engineer. I make a very good living, but it is a living earned through 60-hour weeks, endless site inspections in the brutal cold, and the constant, grinding pressure of corporate deadlines. For 3 years, I quietly authorized a direct transfer of $4,800 from my primary income account to Oak Grove Manor every single month. I never complained. I never held it over Evelyn's head. I simply viewed it as the cost of keeping my wife happy and ensuring an elderly woman lived her final years in comfort. That was my definition of family. I assumed, foolishly, that the safety net I wove for her bloodline would be extended to mine if the unthinkable ever happened. The unthinkable happened on a Tuesday. I was on a construction site when my phone buzzed with a call from the local hospital. My mother, Helen, had slipped on the icy concrete steps of her modest duplex. She was 70 years old, a retired public school cafeteria worker who had spent her entire life serving others. The fall shattered her left femur and fractured her wrist in 3 places. The next 48 hours were a blur of sterile waiting rooms, surgical consultations, and the terrifying realization of how fragile the human body really is. The surgery was a success, but the hospital social worker sat me down and delivered a harsh dose of American healthcare reality. Medicare would cover the hospitalization and a few days in a short-term rehabilitation clinic. But after that, she was being discharged. My mother couldn't walk. She couldn't use her left arm. She needed round-the-clock custodial care at home, help with bathing, dressing, eating, and managing her pain medications. Medicare doesn't cover long-term home health aides for daily living activities. The social worker explained gently. You'll have to pay for a private nurse out of pocket until she recovers enough mobility to manage alone. It's usually a few $1,000s a month for decent, full-time coverage. I wasn't panicked. I had a good job. I had a wife. I had a partnership. Or so I thought. I went home that evening, exhausted to my marrow, smelling of hospital antiseptic and stale coffee. Evelyn was in the kitchen, casually browsing through fabric swatches on her iPad for a living room redesign she had been talking about. I sat down at the island, rubbed my eyes, and explained the situation. I told her about the surgery, the Medicare gaps, and the fact that we would need to allocate about $3,000 a month for the next 4 to 6 months to hire a reliable home care nurse for my mother. Evelyn didn't even look up from her screen. She flipped to a velvet swatch, took a sip of her Pinot Noir, and sighed, not a sigh of empathy, but the specific, irritated sigh of someone being asked to deal with an inconvenience. Arthur, we really can't afford that right now, she said, her tone perfectly even, completely sanitized of any warmth. You know we're trying to build up the savings for the summer house down payment. If your mother's Medicare is that poor, then that's just the reality of her situation. She should have planned her retirement better instead of relying on us to bail her out. I stopped breathing for a second. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt impossibly thin. I stared at the side of her face, waiting for the punchline. waiting for her to look at me and realize how monstrous her words were. She didn't. "Evelyn," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "My mother is lying in a hospital bed with metal pins in her leg. She can't go to the bathroom by herself. I am talking about basic medical care, not a vacation." "I understand that, Arthur, and it's sad," she replied, finally looking up, her eyes defensive and cold. "But we have our own financial boundaries. We can't just drain our accounts because her insurance is inadequate. Maybe she can find a state-run facility to stay in for a while. We are not a charity." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the deafening roar of 1,000 puzzle pieces violently snapping into place. "We are not a charity." She sat there, sipping a $20 glass of wine, lecturing me about financial boundaries and state-run facilities for my mother, while absolutely oblivious to the fact that my paycheck had been single-handedly keeping her own grandmother out of a state-run facility for 36 months. She honestly believed that the money funding Beatrice's luxury existence was simply a natural right of her family, an invisible resource that required no gratitude and certainly no reciprocity. She viewed my mother's genuine emergency as a financial burden, but viewed her grandmother's five-star resort living as an absolute necessity. Something inside me went completely, terrifyingly still. I didn't argue. I didn't try to appeal to her humanity, because I suddenly realized she didn't have any left to appeal to. "You're right," I said softly, standing up from the stool. "We do need to respect our financial boundaries. People should rely on the plans they made for themselves." Evelyn smiled, a tight, satisfied little smirk, clearly pleased that I had backed down so easily and seen reason. "Exactly. It sounds harsh, but we have to protect our own future." She went back to her fabric swatches. She had no idea she had just drafted the blueprint for her own absolute ruin. I walked into my home office and locked the door. I didn't go to sleep. I opened my laptop and logged into my primary checking account. I pulled up the recurring transfers. There it was, Oak Grove Manor, $4,800, auto pay scheduled for the first of the month. I looked at that number and thought about my mother, a woman who had worked 30 years in a hot cafeteria to make sure I could go to college, apologizing to me earlier that day for being a bother. I clicked Cancel Recurring Transfer. I typed my password to confirm. The screen flashed a green checkmark. Next, I opened a new browser tab and searched for the top-rated private home healthcare agencies in my mother's area. I found a highly recommended service that provided certified nursing assistants and registered nurses for round-the-clock home care. The premium package, the one that guaranteed consistent, compassionate care, physical therapy assistance, and meal preparation, cost exactly $4,200 a month. I filled out the intake forms, linked my newly freed-up checking account, and paid the first month's retainer in full. I didn't tell Evelyn. I went about my life for the next 3 weeks with a calm I had never experienced before. It was the calm of a man who had successfully disarmed a bomb and was just waiting to watch the person who built it realize the timer was gone. I worked my hours. I visited my mother every evening at her duplex, watching the incredible private nurse, a woman named Sarah, help my mom regain her strength with dignity and grace. Evelyn noticed my absences, but chalked them up to my usual late nights at the construction sites. She continued planning her kitchen remodel, completely insulated by the false security of an arrangement she had taken for granted. The billing cycle for Oak Grove Manor always hit on the first of the month. They give a 5-day grace period before the administrative office starts making phone calls. On the 6th day of the month, Evelyn's phone rang while we were sitting in the living room. I was reading a trade magazine. I watched her glance at the caller ID, smile her practiced socialite smile, and answer. "Hello, Martha. How are things at Oak Grove? Is my grandmother enjoying the new dining menu?" There was a pause. The smile slowly slid off Evelyn's face, replaced by a look of profound confusion, and then creeping panic. "Declined? What do you mean the payment was declined? There must be a bank error." "No. The account hasn't changed. Have you tried running it again?" She stood up, pacing the rug. "A 30-day notice? Martha, please. That's absurd. I will have this sorted out immediately. Yes. Goodbye." She ended the call and spun around to face me, her face pale. "Arthur, the transfer for my grandmother's care facility didn't go through. They're saying the auto pay was entirely canceled from the source. You need to call the bank right now. If it's not paid by Friday, they're going to start the process of moving her to a lower-tier ward." I slowly closed my magazine and set it on the coffee table. I didn't stand up. I looked at her with the exact same sanitized, emotionless expression she had given me in the kitchen 3 weeks prior. "There's no bank error, Evelyn. I said smoothly. I canceled the transfer. She stared at me, her brain struggling to process the English language. You canceled it? Why? Was the account compromised? No, I replied, crossing my legs. My mother needed a private home care nurse. The premium package cost $4.200 a month, since you made it very clear that we couldn't drain our savings to bail her out, and that her poor Medicare coverage was just the reality of her situation. I had to find the money elsewhere in my budget, so I stopped paying for Oak Grove Manor. The color completely drained from her face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out for several seconds. When she finally found her voice, it was a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. Are you out of your mind? You cut off my grandmother's living facility. Where is she supposed to go, Arthur? She can't live in a state facility, she'll die there. I suppose she should have planned her retirement better, I said, repeating her exact words back to her, watching them land like physical blows. Or perhaps her family can step up, since you have such strong financial boundaries. That is my family, she screamed, tears of rage and panic springing to her eyes. You promised to take care of us. We are your family. You were, I corrected her softly, finally standing up to match her height. Until you looked me in the eye and told me that the woman who gave me life wasn't worth our money. You sat there drinking wine, telling me to put my mother in a state-run facility, while I was literally bleeding myself dry to keep your grandmother in a resort. You don't want a partner, Evelyn. You want a sponsor, and your sponsorship has been permanently revoked. She completely melted down. She threatened, she cried, she begged. She tried to frame me as a monster, a cruel, vindictive man punishing an elderly woman. But I refused to absorb her guilt. I am not punishing Beatrice, I told her, my voice echoing off the high ceilings of the house my money had paid for. I am simply treating your family with the exact same level of financial charity you demanded we show mine. If you want Beatrice to stay at Oak Grove, I suggest you take on some full-time interior design clients and pay the $4.800 yourself, because my money is currently busy keeping my mother safe. I walked out of the living room, leaving her standing there amidst her fabric swatches and her shattered illusions of control. The aftermath was exactly as chaotic as you would expect. Evelyn couldn't raise the funds. Her parents, stripped of their wealthy facade, were forced to admit they were practically broke. Within 30 days, Beatrice was transferred out of the luxury suite at Oak Grove and moved into a standard, Medicare-funded facility. It wasn't a torture chamber. It was clean, safe, and perfectly adequate. But it lacked the private chefs and the hydrotherapy pools, and to Evelyn's family, the downgrade was the ultimate social humiliation. Evelyn tried to rally her family to guilt-trip me. But the moment I laid out the financial reality, that I had single-handedly gifted them over $170,000 over 3 years while they couldn't even offer a word of sympathy for my injured mother, outrage sputtered and died. They had no moral high ground, and they knew it. My mother made a full recovery. The private nurse I hired was an absolute angel. And knowing my mother was safe and cared for brought me a level of peace I hadn't felt in years. As for my marriage, it didn't end with a screaming match. It ended the way a corporation dissolves a bad merger. The trust was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, transactional reality. We are currently navigating the divorce proceedings. Evelyn is fighting for alimony, claiming she grew accustomed to a certain lifestyle. My lawyer is having a field day with the financial records, proving that her lifestyle was entirely subsidized by voluntary payments I am no longer willing to make. I sleep incredibly well these days. I don't feel vindictive, and I don't feel cruel. I just feel incredibly, beautifully free. Revenge doesn't always require you to burn someone's house down. Sometimes, the most devastating thing you can do to a person is simply stop paying their rent. Turn off the lights, and let them live in the reality they created for everyone else.